Nestled in the shadows of the Ural Mountains lies a deceptively beautiful body of water, its surface sparkling under the Russian sun. Lake Karachay seems, at first glance, just another serene landmark in the vast wilderness of the southern Urals. But appearances can be deadly misleading, for this is no ordinary lake. It's a place where nightmares come true, where the water itself holds secrets darker than the deepest ocean trenches. The indigenous Bashkir people who once inhabited these lands spoke of an ancient curse. They claimed that evil spirits dwelled within these waters, waiting to claim unwary souls who ventured too close to its shores. For centuries, locals avoided the lake, passing down warnings through generations. These folk tales, once dismissed as superstitious nonsense by modern science, now seem eerily prophetic. Because Lake Karachay isn't just cursed by ancient spirits, it's cursed by man's own hubris and the invisible poison we unleashed upon the world. In 1948, as the Cold War cast its shadow across the globe, the Soviet Union built a secret nuclear facility called Mayak in the isolated Chelyabinsk province. Hidden from both foreign and domestic eyes, Mayak was dedicated to producing plutonium for nuclear weapons. The facility operated under a code name, with the nearby city of Ozersk being concealed from maps and wiped from official records. The scientists and workers at Mayak faced immense pressure to deliver results quickly. Safety protocols were secondary to production targets. The Soviet nuclear program raced forward at breakneck speed, cutting corners wherever necessary. And when it came to disposing of the highly radioactive waste produced during plutonium processing, they found a convenient solution in the nearby Lake Karachay. Beginning in 1951, Mayak officials made a fateful decision. Rather than constructing proper containment facilities for their toxic byproducts, they began dumping liquid radioactive waste directly into the lake. The seemingly perfect disposal site was small, just about 45 hectares in area, and had no outlet streams that might carry contamination elsewhere. Year after year, truckloads of radioactive waste were poured into Karachay's waters. Cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium-239, and dozens of other radioactive isotopes accumulated in its depths. The lake silently absorbed the poison, its waters growing more lethal with each passing day. The lake's deadly transformation remained classified, known only to those with the highest security clearances, but the radioactive monster they were creating couldn't remain hidden forever. On September 29, 1957, disaster struck. A cooling system in one of Mayak's waste storage tanks failed, causing the radioactive waste to explode with the force of 70 tons of TNT. This catastrophic event, known as the Kishtim disaster, ranked as a level 6 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, making it the third worst nuclear accident in history. Behind only Chernobyl and Fukushima, the explosion released about 20 million curies of radioactivity, contaminating an area of more than 20,000 square kilometers. Nearby villages were evacuated, though many residents had already received lethal doses of radiation. Yet even this devastating accident remained state secret, with the Soviet government refusing to acknowledge it had occurred until 1989, more than 30 years later. Despite this catastrophe, Mayak continued operations, and Lake Karachay continued to receive the facility's liquid radioactive waste. By 1967, the situation at Lake Karachay had grown more dire. A drought exposed radioactive sediment along the shoreline. When summer winds swept across the dry lake bed, they picked up contaminated dust and carried it across the countryside. Over 500,000 people were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, though most would never know the true cause of the illnesses that followed. Soviet authorities finally recognized they could no longer ignore the monster they had created. Between 1978 and 1990, they filled the lake with concrete blocks and soil, effectively turning much of it into a solid surface. But even these extreme measures couldn't fully contain the damage already done. By the time remediation efforts began, Lake Karachay had accumulated radioactivity comparable to the total amount released during the Chernobyl disaster. The tales that emerged from the regions surrounding Lake Karachay defy belief. Yet they're documented in declassified government records, scientific studies, and the haunting testimonies of survivors. Fishermen reported catching fish with grotesque deformities, some with missing fins, others with tumors bulging from their scales. The men who consumed these catches often fell ill within days, suffering symptoms that local doctors struggled to diagnose. Farmers watched in horror as their livestock gave birth to stillborn calves with extra limbs or missing eyes. Their crops withered despite adequate rainfall, and the fruit that did grow was misshapen and bitter. But the human toll was by far the most devastating. In villages downwind from Lake Karachay, cancer rates soared to levels 50 times higher than the national average. Children were born with genetic abnormalities at alarming rates. A mysterious condition locals called Karachay syndrome plagued the region, characterized by sudden weakness, unexplained bleeding, hair loss, and immune system collapse. Medical records from the 1960s and 70s describe patients whose bone marrow simply stopped producing new cells, leading to a slow, painful decline as their bodies lost the ability to fight infection or produce blood. Doctors, unaware of the radioactive contamination, were baffled by these cases. One disturbing account comes from Dr. Mikhail Sokolovsky, who worked at a clinic in Chelyabinsk province during the 1970s. He described treating 3 young men who had gone fishing at Lake Karachay despite local warnings. According to his notes, the men spent approximately 5 hours on the lakeshore. Within days, all 3 developed acute radiation sickness. Patient B exhibits the most severe symptoms, Dr. Sokolovsky wrote. His skin is sloughing off in large patches. His hair has fallen out completely. Internal bleeding has begun. Despite our best efforts, I do not expect him to survive the week. All 3 men died within 21 days of their exposure. Even more chilling are accounts of individuals who merely stood at the lake's edge. Viktor Fetisov, a former Mayak employee, testified that standing near the most contaminated parts of Lake Karachay for just 1 hour would deliver a lethal dose of 600 roentgens, enough to kill a human within a week. Security guards tasked with patrolling the perimeter worked in shifts of no more than 15 minutes to limit their exposure. You could feel it, Fetisov recalled. A strange warmth on your skin even in winter, a metallic taste in your mouth. Some reported seeing flashes of light in their vision. That's the radiation interacting directly with your optic nerve. We called them Karachay lights. If you saw them, you knew you'd already received too much exposure. The lake's deadly reputation spread through whispered conversations. Locals developed their own folklore around the site, updating ancient superstitions with modern understanding. They spoke of the Karachay curse, claiming that the evil spirits of the lake had been strengthened by man's atomic fire. Parents warned children that the atom witch lived in Lake Karachay, ready to poison those who ventured too close. The witch was invisible like radiation itself, detectable only when it was too late. These stories served a vital purpose, keeping curious youngsters away from one of the most dangerous places on Earth. By the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's fall, the true horror of Lake Karachay began to emerge on the world stage. International scientists confirmed that standing on the shore for a single hour would deliver enough radiation to kill a human being. In certain hotspots, just 5 minutes of exposure could deliver a lethal dose. The lake had earned the dubious distinction of being the most polluted spot on the planet, more contaminated than the evacuated zones around Chernobyl or nuclear testing grounds. Yet despite remediation efforts, Lake Karachay's curse continues to spread. Radioactive groundwater plumes extend outward from the lake, contaminating underground aquifers that feed into the Techa River and eventually the Ob River system, one of Siberia's largest. Studies indicate that radioactive contamination from Lake Karachay has traveled over 100 kilometers downstream, affecting communities that have never heard of the lake. The isotopes dumped into Karachay include those with half-lives spanning decades to millennia. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years, strontium-90 persists for 29 years, but plutonium-239, also present in significant quantities, has a half-life of 24,100 years. This means that even 24,000 years from now, a time further in the future than the construction of the ancient pyramids is in our past, half of that plutonium will still remain radioactive. In effect, The Soviet Union created a toxic legacy that will outlast not just their government, but possibly human civilization itself. The most haunting aspect of Lake Karachay's curse may be its invisibility. Radiation leaves no distinctive smell or taste. It can't be seen with the naked eye. Those exposed often have no idea until symptoms begin to appear, and by then, the damage is already done. This imperceptible nature gives radiation an almost supernatural quality, much like the evil spirits the Bashkir people once warned about. Elena Karimova, an environmental activist whose family lived near the Teka River for generations, describes this invisible torment. "My grandmother would tell me not to swim in the river because bad spirits lived there. Years later, I learned those spirits were actually radioactive particles. But the effect is the same. They enter your body unseen, they change you from within, and they bring suffering. The old superstitions had wisdom in them after all." The long-term genetic impacts of Lake Karachay's contamination may be the most insidious aspect of its curse. Studies of families in the affected regions show elevated rates of genetic mutations that can be passed down through generations. Children born decades after the primary contamination events still show chromosomal abnormalities linked to radiation exposure through their parents or grandparents. Dr. Lyudmila Krestinina, who has studied the health effects of radiation.
A legendary story from Stalin's inner circle tells of a man bold or foolish enough to knock the dictator's pipe from his hand. During a tense Kremlin meeting, the gesture stunned everyone, as even minor disrespect towards Stalin could mean death. Some say it was a drunken general who acted on impulse. Others
traditional folklore. Despite the dangers, many residents express a deep attachment to their homeland. "This is where my ancestors lived for centuries," explains Tatiana Volkovyak, an elderly resident near the Teka River. "Yes, it is damaged. Yes, it may be dangerous, but it is still our home. We have learned to live with the curse, to respect it without surrendering to fear." Multiple generations have grown up in the shadow of contamination, developing adaptations to navigate their poisoned landscape. They check wild mushrooms and berries with Geiger counters before eating them. They avoid certain fishing spots known to yield contaminated catch. They track wind patterns and stay indoors during dust storms. The health impacts remain severe despite these precautions. Cancer rates in the region far exceed national averages. Life expectancy is approximately 7 years shorter than in comparable Russian communities without radioactive contamination. Children born with congenital defects are still more common than they should be. Medical researchers studying these populations face significant challenges. It's difficult to prove definitively that any individual illness was caused by radiation exposure rather than other factors. The Russian government has been reluctant to acknowledge the full scope of health impacts, partly due to potential liability issues. Dr. Mira Kolkunova, an epidemiologist who has studied cancer clusters in the region, describes the challenge. "We see the patterns clearly in the data. Elevated rates of certain cancers, immune disorders, reproductive problems. But connecting individual cases directly to radiation exposure is statistically complex. The government prefers this ambiguity. It allows them to avoid responsibility. This pattern of denial has been consistent from the Soviet era through the modern Russian Federation. When the Kishtim disaster occurred in 1957, locals were told that the strange glowing cloud was the northern lights. When people began falling ill from radiation exposure, their medical records were classified. This official secrecy has contributed to the mythologizing of Lake Karachay. In the absence of transparent information, local folklore filled the gap. Stories spread about mutant creatures living in the forests surrounding the lake, two-headed wolves, fish that glow in the dark, and mosquitoes large enough to drain a child's blood. Most of these tales are exaggerations, but they contain kernels of truth about radiation's biological impacts. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Lake Karachay is how easily it could be forgotten by the wider world. Despite being one of the most contaminated places on Earth, it receives far less attention than Chernobyl or Fukushima. The lake exists primarily as a footnote in books about nuclear disasters, rather than as a cautionary tale in its own right. This obscurity compounds the danger. knowledge about the site could be lost over generations, particularly during periods of political instability. Future civilizations might rediscover Lake Karachay without understanding its lethal nature. Nuclear semioticians have proposed creating warning systems designed to transcend language and cultural barriers. Messages that would remain comprehensible thousands of years into the future. These range from massive earthworks in threatening shapes to fields of jagged spikes surrounding the contaminated area. Thomas Sebeok, a linguist who worked on nuclear semiotics, proposed creating an atomic priesthood, a group that would preserve knowledge about radioactive sites through a combination of written records and oral traditions. The concept acknowledges the quasi-religious nature of the danger, a force powerful enough to require spiritual as well as scientific respect. For now, Lake Karachay sits beneath its concrete cap, its radioactive content slowly decaying according to immutable physical laws. The half-lives of its most dangerous isotopes tick down with glacial slowness. Cesium-137 and strontium-90 will remain dangerous for another century, while the plutonium will remain lethal for time spans that dwarf human civilization. In the villages surrounding this toxic legacy, life continues. Children are born, grow up, and have children of their own. Some develop illnesses linked to radiation exposure. Others appear unaffected. The invisible nature of the danger means no one can truly know if they've escaped the curse until the end of their lives, and perhaps not even then, as genetic damage may manifest only in future generations. Local shamans, blending traditional Bashkir beliefs with modern understanding, perform rituals they claim will protect against radiation. They burn herbs said to cleanse the body of radioactive particles and create amulets containing minerals believed to absorb radiation. Our ancestors knew to avoid Lake Karachay centuries before Geiger counters existed, says Ruslan Gabdulin, a modern shaman. They sensed something wrong with the place. They called it evil spirits. We call it radiation. Different words for the same warning. This blend of ancient superstition and modern threat creates a unique cultural response to an unprecedented danger. The Karachay curse exists simultaneously as scientific fact and mythological construct, a hazard that can be measured with specialized equipment, yet remains invisible to ordinary human senses. Visitors to the region report a palpable sense of unease, a feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with the land itself. This psychological response may serve a protective function, keeping people away from the most dangerous areas and insects that should have been there. Our bodies warned us even without scientific education. This bodily knowledge, the capacity to sense subtle environmental changes without technical instruments, represents a form of adaptation to the radioactive landscape. Locals report being able to feel when they're in a high radiation area, through symptoms like tingling skin, sudden headaches, or an unexplained sense of fatigue. While these sensations wouldn't occur at lower exposure levels, they might indeed represent early physiological responses to significant radiation. The isolation of Lake Karachay and the communities around it adds another dimension to its haunting quality. The closed city of Ozersk wasn't on public maps until the 1990s. Its residents weren't allowed to tell outsiders where they lived or what they did. They couldn't receive visitors without special permission, couldn't leave without authorization, and were forbidden from discussing their work, even with family members. This secrecy created a parallel society, one where knowledge of radiation hazards was commonplace, but couldn't be shared with the outside world. Former residents described the psychological burden of knowing their work was poisoning the surrounding countryside, while being unable to warn potentially affected communities. "We lived in a bubble of knowledge," explains former Mayak engineer Viktor Kulikov. "We understood the dangers. We had dosimeters in our homes. We knew which areas to avoid. But just kilometers away, people were fishing in contaminated rivers and gathering berries in forests where radioactive dust had settled. We couldn't tell them. That knowledge is its own kind of curse." The health impacts on Mayak workers themselves constitute another chapter in Lake Karachay's grim legacy. Early workers received minimal protection from radiation exposure. Many developed chronic radiation sickness, characterized by immune system collapse, neurological problems, and eventually cancer. By some estimates, over 8,000 workers died prematurely due to their exposure during the facility's first decades of operation. Victor Silkin, who worked at Mayak in the 1960s, recalls the cavalier attitude toward safety. "They gave us cloth masks for some tasks. For others, nothing at all. We would joke about glowing in the dark. Later, when people started dying, the jokes stopped." Former workers describe a compensation system that acknowledged radiation-related illnesses only after they reached advanced stages. Many died before receiving the benefits they were entitled to. Others struggled through Byzantine bureaucratic processes while battling terminal conditions. The Russian government's reluctance to fully acknowledge these occupational illnesses compounds the suffering of affected families. In the past decade, a new generation of activists has emerged, often the grandchildren of Mayak workers or downriver residents, demanding greater transparency and comprehensive health studies. They face significant challenges from both government obstruction and public apathy. Most Russians have never heard of Lake Karachay, despite its status as their country's most contaminated site. Nadezhda Kutepova, founder of the NGO Planet of Hopes, which advocates for Mayak victims, was forced to flee Russia in 2015 after being accused of industrial espionage for her work documenting radiation impacts. Her experience illustrates the continuing sensitivity surrounding Lake Karachay and the Mayak facility, sites the government would prefer to keep in obscurity. International oversight remains limited. The International Atomic Energy Agency has conducted periodic assessments of the site, but lacks enforcement power to compel additional remediation efforts. Environmental organizations like Greenpeace have been denied access to the most contaminated areas, limiting independent verification of conditions. The financial burden of maintaining Lake Karachay's containment systems falls entirely on Russia, creating a potential vulnerability should economic conditions deteriorate. The ongoing costs are substantial. Monitoring systems must be maintained, groundwater must be regularly tested, and the concrete cap requires periodic inspection and repair. Some nuclear experts worry that climate change could exacerbate the dangers at Lake Karachay. Increased precipitation in the region could raise the water table, potentially bringing contaminated groundwater closer to the surface. More extreme weather events could damage containment structures. Droughts could once again expose contaminated sediments to wind erosion. Yet despite these challenges, life continues in the shadow of Lake Karachay. Children are born, grow up, and have families of their own. Communities adapt to their contaminated reality, developing cultural practices and local knowledge to minimize risks. The landscape itself shows signs of resilience. Certain plant and animal species have returned to areas that were once completely barren, though often showing subtle genetic adaptations to their radioactive environment. The curse of Lake Karachay serves as a grim reminder of the long-term consequences of nuclear contamination. Unlike conventional pollutants that break down over years or decades, radioactive materials operate on timeframes almost incomprehensible to human understanding. The decisions made by Soviet officials in the 1950s created a toxic legacy that will outlast not just their government, but possibly modern civilization itself. The most haunting aspect of Lake Karachay's curse may be its invisibility. Radiation leaves no distinctive smell or taste. It can't be seen. Those exposed often have no idea until symptoms begin to appear, and by then, the damage is already done. This imperceptible nature gives radiation an almost supernatural quality, much like the evil spirits the Bashkir people once warned about. The long-term genetic impacts of Lake Karachay's contamination may be the most insidious aspect of its curse. Studies of families in the affected regions show elevated rates of genetic mutations that can be passed down through generations. Children born decades after the contamination events still show chromosomal abnormalities linked to radiation exposure. Through their parents or grandparents, Dr. Lyudmila Krestinina, who studies the health effects of radiation in the southern Urals, notes, "We see effects in the children of exposed individuals, and even in their grandchildren. The genetic damage doesn't simply disappear with time. It embeds itself in the family lineage. This generational impact gives Lake Karachay's curse a truly mythological dimension, like the ancestral curses of ancient legends that follow bloodlines through centuries. Except this curse has solid scientific grounding in the mutagenic properties of ionizing radiation. In the villages that dot the contaminated landscape, the older generation continues to pass down their hard-won knowledge about living in a poisoned land. They teach children which mushrooms accumulate the most radiation, which wines bring contaminated dust, which wells provide the safest water. This local ecological knowledge, blending traditional wisdom with bitter experience, represents a unique cultural adaptation to an unprecedented environmental threat. "We live with the curse," says elderly Teka River resident Marfa Kosheleva. "We respect it, we take precautions, but we do not let it consume our lives with fear. This is still our home, the land of our ancestors. Poisoned or not, it is where we belong." This defiant attachment to place, even in the face of invisible danger, speaks to human resilience and adaptation. The communities around Lake Karachay have developed their own understanding of what it means to coexist with contamination, neither denying the dangers nor surrendering to them completely. The curse of Lake Karachay will continue for millennia to come, its radioactive heart slowly decaying beneath its concrete shroud. The isotopes will follow their immutable half-lives, gradually diminishing in potency but remaining dangerous far beyond any time frame humans can comprehend. Future generations will inherit this toxic legacy, along with the responsibility for maintaining knowledge about its dangers.
A legendary story from Stalin's inner circle tells of a man bold or foolish enough to knock the dictator's pipe from his hand. During a tense Kremlin meeting, the gesture stunned everyone, as even minor disrespect toward Stalin could mean death. Some say it was a drunken general who acted on impulse. Others claim it was a loyal friend testing Stalin's temper. Remarkably, Stalin reportedly laughed it off, though the man vanished soon after. Whether myth or truth, the tale captures the fear and unpredictability that defined life under Stalin's rule.